Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. We are barely 3 weeks away from the start of pre-season testing of these new 2026 cars, and Lewis Hamilton gives his perspective on what his expectations are of this new era, describing the previous era as the worst generation of cars that he has ever driven. Surely it can't get worse than that for him, but could it get worse than that for Ferrari, with other rumours emerging today that the other manufacturers are potentially in a stronger position? Lots to get into. Very much enjoy your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Lots of talk, of course, at this time of year. Who's going to be the strongest team? We've got a little bit more to discuss on that as well, especially on the Mercedes power unit front and what that means for some of their customer teams. So Alpine, they've moved away from the Renault Alpine power unit they've used that has been relatively underpowered over the last few years. Gasly, of course, actually had an alright season. I think he made Q3 like 11 times or something, like nearly half the races he was in final part of qualifying, which was surprisingly impressive, I think, given the strength of that car and package. They gave up on it, as we know, Alpine, very early on, as of course did Williams, but Williams had a much stronger starting point than Alpine, and Williams was still pretty good even towards the end of the season. Albon had a great start to the year. Sainz scored a couple of podiums, as we know, along the way. Gasly, though, says light at the end of the tunnel, we're finally going to turn it around at Alpine. Where are your guys' expectations for Alpine? Because they should be in a better position, but will they be as well positioned as Williams? I think Williams are possibly the most exciting team for 2026. I think I'd put Aston Martin in that category as well, but we're talking dark horses here. These are the clear dark horses. Williams, because they sacrificed a lot for 2026. They made major changes behind the scenes in that operation over the last few years. James Vowles, it seems, is making a lot of good decisions. They've got serious backing right now that they didn't have all those years ago. And of course, they also have pedigree, they have heritage, they have history, they have so many championships under their belt. It's been a long time since they have been at the top of the sport, but it was also quite a long time since McLaren had been at the top of the sport. Look, I'm not expecting Williams to come out and win the championship, but they are, I think, in many respects the team to watch, because with that Mercedes power unit, who knows how competitive they could really be. So that Williams-Alpine discussion is going to be interesting. I think Aston Martin, though, are the other team, because as much as Williams are exciting, they are fundamentally still a customer team of Mercedes, and given the fact that McLaren just won the championship and Mercedes are still Mercedes and they were second in this year's championship anyway and are expected to get better next year, it's difficult to imagine that Williams can finish any higher than third, really, but they do have a strong driver pairing, as we know. Whereas Aston Martin, because of the Honda thing and the Newey thing, they have probably more variability in the sense that they could be pretty bad if the engine isn't great and other factors don't work out in their favour. But also, I think Aston Martin's chances of winning are probably higher, just because they at least have an offset from a power unit perspective to where Mercedes are. Now, speaking of those question marks, this is what the markets suggest. So this is on like Polymarket. And this is, I think we looked at this a couple of weeks ago, and I'll keep you guys updated on this because it's just absolutely all over the place. Nobody really knows. But McLaren, I think the other day maybe we saw that Mercedes were favourites. Maybe it was closer. But McLaren are considered favourites for the Constructors' Championship again. I think presumably because they have two very solid drivers who achieved great things out of their car last season. Mercedes, I think, are overall considered to have the stronger package in the balance of probabilities. That's the way the market is currently pricing things. But because Antonelli is only in his second year, the chances of winning the Constructors for Mercedes are considered slightly lower. Then Red Bull, a 12% chance. Then Ferrari, which is pretty ugly for Ferrari right now, it's got to be said. Now, look, where is this data coming from? Obviously, we don't really know. It's based on trading volume, of which there isn't really much in this market, as you can see. But people are giving their perspectives, and as we currently understand from what's being said in the media, Ferraris, their chances are significant, but certainly not substantial. Them being behind Red Bull is pretty rough for now. Then Aston Martin, considered fifth favourites at about 8%. Then Williams, then Alpine, Audi, and Haas, Cadillac, and Racing Bulls kind of bringing up the rear, as it were, especially, Haas and Racing Bulls as kind of customer team. Well, they are customer teams, but Racing Bulls being literally the B team of Red Bull. their chances to win are like zero, because there's no way they'd ever be above Red Bull Racing, presumably, even if they were the best team. So that's what it looks like from a constructor's perspective. The driver's perspective looks like this. So a number of drivers on less than 1%, basically zero. Lindblad, Ocon, Lawson, Bortoletto, Behrman, Colapinto, Gasly, Hulkenberg, Bottas, Perez. Those drivers are considered to be basically 0% chance. Albon, 1%. Stroll, 1%. Hadjar 1%, Sainz 1%. So those are your 1%ers. Then you've got the two, well, near enough, the two Ferrari guys. Hamilton's only considered to have a 2% chance of winning the title right now, which feels maybe a smidge low. I don't think it's high, necessarily, but I think Hamilton's chances of winning the championship are probably higher than this. Like, if Ferrari actually do deliver a great car, which the chances, it seems, are relatively low, according to what the market seems to think. But if they do, I think Hamilton's chances of converting a great car into a championship are pretty similar to Leclerc's. So I'm surprised to see them separated by this much. Again, it's not massive either way. Leclerc's considered to have a 6% chance. Antonelli also a 6% chance. Then, the fifth favourite for the season is Fernando Alonso in the hypothetical Aston Martin, if it was to be very good. He's sitting at 7%. Then you've got the two McLaren boys, Piastri at 11%, Norris at 17%. And, I mean, it just goes to show how difficult to predict this season is and how controversial many of these numbers will be. Norris is the reigning world champion. McLaren are considered the constructors' favourites, but yet their drivers are third and fourth in the odds, according to the market. And you can understand why, given the discussions we're having, right? I mean, Hadjar's got a 1% chance. Verstappen is considered title favourite with a 26% chance to win. Look, are you taking Max or the field? Obviously, you're taking the field. But when you look at it like this, you can see why. And Russell in second with 24%. So those are apparently the two title favourites. I mean, wow, would I love to see a proper title battle between those two. Who knows what Red Bull are going to be doing from the chassis front, but if it's good enough and the engine is good enough, as we know, Max Verstappen will find a way to be a threat, at least on occasion. So that's how things currently look. As I say, as the weeks go by and more news comes out, and potentially more individuals from some of these teams start to put a little bit of money into the market, you might start to see those numbers shift. Now, Aston, we've talked a fair bit about them recently. There's some talk about optimism around their fuel and all this. There was actually some reporting today that suggested, now this is coming out of GP blog, somewhat unreliable, but the argument is that Mercedes and potentially Red Bull have this advantage in their engine because of this compression ratio trick that the FIA are happy with, we've discussed in recent weeks. That is apparently worth around very long circuits, potentially up to 0.4 of a second a lap. Now, that is a substantial advantage. GP blogs say that Aston Martin's fuel advantage, if their Aramco power is better, the fuel basically, than what Mercedes have with Petronas, that would be worth another 0.4 a lap. So they would gain that performance back on the fuel. So feel free to make your own perspective on this. It's very difficult to say. Of course, Ferrari, they've got the Shell fuel, which is biofuel, which is different to what Aston are building. But look, do I expect Aramco to have a better fuel than Petronas? Probably yes. I mean, they've been doing it for Formula 2 now. They're probably, in terms of e-fuels, synthetic fuels, the most advanced manufacturer going. So I think there's a good chance that when it comes to the synthetic fuels, Aramco probably will be leading the way, or certainly will be close to it. From the biofuel side, it looks like Ferrari could get some good performance out of Shell. So look, it's possible Mercedes and Red Bull have a very strong engine itself, but the fuel advantage leans Ferrari and Aston, and everyone's on the same page. The likelihood of that is pretty slim, but it's not impossible. There's some talk about it in the media. The other talk is that apparently Honda, because Honda quit, right? A few years ago, they were out of here. But then, of course, we started to realize, all right, they are going to come back in and work this time full-time with Aston Martin. Now, apparently, they've had budget limit allocated over the last few years, but they didn't exhaust it in 23 or 24. So I'm not sure whether that means they can now spend it now. But yeah, apparently they didn't fully use the budget in 23 or 24. Whether that means that they were like so advanced on things that they didn't need it or whatever, at the end of the day, we don't know how strong these power units are going to be. What we do know is they will be important. Nicholas Tambassis, when asked effectively what will be the differentiating factor, says he thinks it will be the internal combustion engine, this is funny, like ironic in a way, because the whole thing about F1 with these new regulations is, oh, we're pushing sustainability, we're really doing a good thing for the environment, net zero 2030 or whatever they like to talk about. Because we're really pushing the battery stuff, the internal combustion engine's a thing of the past, right? They don't maybe say this, but it's kind of implied in F1's direction and what the manufacturers were thinking a few years ago when these regulations were designed. It's now pretty different in terms of the way the manufacturers are thinking. The smart money seems to be on the next era of engine regs will be V8s, maybe naturally aspirated, maybe with a turbo, maybe with some sort of electrical component, a hybrid, but probably not 50%, probably more similar to what we just had, basically, but with a V8 instead of a turbo V6. That's what people seem to be talking about now, because the manufacturers are realizing that there certainly is still a future in internal combustion, especially with these sustainable fuels. The point I was making is that there's all this talk about this set of regulations being super about the electric component, all about the sustainability, but actually the innovation and the differentiation in this era looks like it's still going to be on the internal combustion engine side, right? So apparently that's still going to be where the focus is and still where the performance differentiator is. Not a bad thing as far as I'm concerned. That's what the FIA say. But we also saw the other day some comments out of Pat Simmons. Now, he used to work for Formula One Management as their technical director. He was frustrated, if you guys missed that video a couple of days ago, that the FIA were, let's say, bending over too much to the teams and their desires, because the F1 guys, when they were designing the 2022 regs, they told the teams what they were going to do. The teams pushed back on various things and they said, okay, we hear you here and there, but we are going to do this anyway. Now, apparently for 2026 engines, there was one team. We rumoured that it could well be Mercedes. It could also be Ferrari. There's not many other candidates that make sense. I think it's more likely Mercedes than anybody else, but you guys were giving your perspective a couple of days ago. They were vehemently against any additional energy recovery from the front axle after the removal of the MGUH to make up for the lost power recovery. Now, with all that said, Pat Simmons is not very happy about this development. He says that the car's now a camel because we have very powerful electric motors, but we don't have enough energy recovery to make that work. And as a result, the car just is naturally compromised, and there are major issues the teams will have to overcome. Largely, the ways to overcome those issues will not be ideal for anyone. So he's not very happy about the way the engine regulations ended up. He thinks that things should have been handled differently over the last few years. What I thought was very interesting in kind of consideration of that is that Giuliano De Chessa, Italian journalist, very close with Ferrari, very close really with a number of teams, that publication at Auto Racer, he's back from his New Year Christmas break and he says, new year, new life for all those who love F1, all new cars too. And then, kind of unprompted, he says, I totally agree with Pat Simmons. We will have race cars that stutter and start and other collateral problems to face. The factories are back up and running. Starting tomorrow, we begin to talk about it seriously. So I'm very much looking forward to what De Chessa has to say over the coming weeks about what is happening here behind the scenes. But it's just interesting that he says, yeah, these cars are going to be problematic. There will be issues to face. There will be technical directives. It's going to be a dramatic season. Now, Hamilton gives his perspective on what's just happened, really, and what he can expect going forwards. Because, look, he, of course, will have driven these new cars in the simulator. Many of the drivers, when they first drove them, were not especially keen on what they found because they're just unusual to drive. Hamilton even, I think, said himself, they have so much torque because of the electric motor now being like 50% of the power generation, that in the wet, when they simulate that, they're almost impossible to get good traction. Very, very challenging to drive in wet conditions. So we'll see how that plays out. Incredibly fast acceleration, for sure. The active aero changes things quite radically in terms of what the driver needs to do, the energy deployment. It's clearly going to be a very different style of driving required, not just because aerodynamically the cars are different, but also because of how important energy management, energy deployment will be, given the nature of things. But Hamilton was obviously not a big fan of these most recent regulations, right? These cars did not suit naturally his style. he still did, 2023 was a really great season for him. 24, of course, he won those couple of races, notably Silverstone. 2022, he was still okay, actually, but of course, with respect to where he was the previous couple of seasons. And then 25, no doubt, his worst season, arguably ever, really. His head was dropping quite significantly throughout the year. And there's multiple reasons for that. He himself admitted, so did Ferrari. We've given up a lot on this car, focusing a lot on next year. Clearly the frustration was spilling over. Hamilton's performance did stabilise in the middle of the season, but towards the end of the year did fall off a little bit again. And yeah, it was not a good season for Hamilton, as we know, but his style has always been late braking, turning hard into corners, hoping that the rear end is going to be stable enough to cope with that. But that was just not how these cars really generated performance. And you could not drive these cars really at the limit, or certainly not over the limit. If you're trying to drive these cars like when Hamilton first came into the sport, where you just throw it into the corner and, it's going to stick. And that was also how the cars worked really from 2017 to 2021, when they were bigger, more fearsome, but certainly more downforce, and still relatively lightweight compared to what we have. Not lightweight, but compared to today, they were lighter cars. Hamilton would be able to just turn in, brake late, and that's how the car liked to be driven and wanted to respond. Now, look, if you put a 23-year-old Hamilton into this year's Ferrari, into the Mercedes in the last few years in the Grand Effect era, I think he's able to adapt far quicker than a 40-year-old Hamilton is able to do. And even Lando Norris, Max Verstappen, they talked about this idea that these ground effect cars, if you drive them at 100% in qualifying, you go slower. You have to drive them at, 97, 96% of what you feel you could do, because the cars perform better slightly under the limit, which is somewhat unnatural, and many of the drivers struggle with this to a degree, but Hamilton, of course, was probably the most notable. But he says this generation was probably the worst one. I'm praying the next one is not worse than that. So, look, he thinks it's only going to get better. Of course, that's also the approach that Ferrari have taken. Hamilton himself admitting that, yeah, we sacrificed a lot from this most recent season for the new car. And I think in general, Hamilton's right. Whatever you think about these most recent regs, they started well. 2022, I think people were happy about the racing early doors, but due to various reasons, that was unlikely to last. The cars didn't produce great racing for us fans towards the end of the era. Things are very close in terms of competitiveness, but I think a lot of that can be put down to the cost cap and to testing time limits and stuff like that, rather than actually the nature of the regulations themselves. The drivers also generally didn't enjoy driving them. Very heavy, not very agile. You can't drive different lines through certain corners because the cars are simply too big to get away with that nowadays. They were brutal because of how stiff the suspension had to be for the ride height stability, for the spines of the drivers. Max Verstappen dominated this era, really. He did not have a good time driving these cars. Neither did any of the drivers, really. Gasly, I think, said that if we were to drive these type of cars for our entire careers, we wouldn't make it to an entire career. It was that bad physically for the drivers. So, look, no doubt that I'm sure many of the drivers agree with Hamilton that from many perspectives, this era was not a good one. The next era, the Venturi tunnels are gone. The stability of the floor platform is less critical. The potentially a return of a little bit of rake. Ground effect will still be there to an extent, but I think many of us are expecting some sort of middle ground between what we have just had and what was the case back in 2021 and previously in terms of what style is required to drive the car. That should be good news for Hamilton, but it could well be good news for other drivers as well. So very much enjoy your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.